Hi guys, let's start part 2 of chapter 8, that is Clothing, a Social History. 4.1, Caste Conflict and Race Change. Though there were no formal sumptuary laws as in Europe, India had its own strict social codes of food and dress. The caste system clearly defined what subordinate and dominant caste Hindus should wear, eat, etc., and these codes had the force of law. Changes in clothing styles that threatened these norms therefore often created violent social reactions. In May 1822, women of the Shanar caste were attacked by Nairs in public places in the southern princely state of Travancore for wearing a cloth across their upper bodies. Over subsequent decades, a violent conflict over dress codes ensued. The Shanars, later known as Nadars, many of whom were considered a subordinate caste and so were generally prohibited from using umbrellas and wearing shoes or golden ornaments. Men and women were also expected to follow the local custom of never covering their upper bodies before the dominant caste. The term Nadar came to be used for all Shanars by the time of the 1921 census. So they are called Nadars. Under the influence of Christian missionaries, Shanar women converts began in the 1820s to wear tailored blouses and clothes to cover themselves like the dominant caste. Hindu reformers such as Aya Vaikundar also participated in dress reform. Soon, Nairs, one of the dominant caste of the region, attacked these women in public places and tore off their upper clothes. Complaints were also filed in court against this dress change, especially since Sanars were also refusing to render free labor for the dominant caste. At first, the government of Travancore issued a proclamation in 1829 ordering Shanar women to abstain in future from covering the upper parts of the body, but this did not prevent Shanar Christian women and even Shanar Hindus from adopting the blouse and upper cloth. The abolition of slavery in Travancore in 1855. So the abolition of slavery in Travancore in 1855 led to even more frustration among the dominant caste who felt they were losing control. In October 1859, riots broke out as Sanar women were attacked in the marketplace and stripped of their upper clothes. Houses were looted and chapels burned. Finally, the government issued another proclamation permitting Shanar women, whether Christian or Hindu, to wear a jacket or cover their upper bodies in any manner whatever, but not like the women of high caste. 4.2, British Rule and Dress Codes. How did the British react to Indian ways of dressing? How did Indians react to British attitudes? In different cultures, specific items of clothing often convey contrary meanings. This frequently leads to misunderstanding and conflicts. Styles of clothing in British India changed through such conflicts. Consider the case of the turban and the hat. When European traders first began frequenting India, They were distinguished from the Indian turban wearers as the head wearers. So they were distinguished from the Indian turban wearers as the head wearers. These two headgears not only looked different, they also signified different things. The turban in India was not just for protection from the heat, but was a sign of respectability and could not be removed at will. In the Western tradition, the hat had to be removed before social superiors as a sign of respect. Okay, for Indian, the turban it should not be removed, and it's a sign of respect and could not be removed at will. And for the Western hat, it had to be removed before social superiors as a sign of respect. This cultural difference created misunderstanding. The British were often offended if Indians did not take off their turban when they met colonial officials. Many Indians, on the other hand, wore the turban to consciously assert their regional or national identity. Here we have figure 14. Europeans bringing gifts to Shahjahan, Agra, 1633, from the Padshahnama. Notice the European visitors' hats at the bottom of the picture, creating a contrast with the turbans of the courtiers. We have here another figure. Figure 15. Sir M. Vishveshwaraya, a leading engineer, technocrat, and the Diwan of Mysore state from 1912 to 1918. He wore a turban with his three-piece Western-style suit. Another such conflict related to the wearing of shoes. At the beginning of the 19th century, it was customary for British officials to follow Indian etiquette and remove their footwear in the courts of ruling kings or chiefs. Some British officials also wore Indian clothes, but in 1830 Europeans were forbidden from wearing Indian clothes at official functions, so that the cultural identity of the white masters was not undermined. So they had to wear their European clothes. Box 3. The turban on the head. The Mysore turban, called peta, was edged with gold lace and adopted as part of the Darbar dress of the Mysore court in the mid-19th century. By the end of the 19th century, a wide variety of officials, teachers, and artists in Mysore began wearing the turban, sometimes with the western suit, as a sign of belonging to the princely state. Today, the Mysore turban is used largely on ceremonial occasions and to honor visiting dignitaries. At the same time, Indians were expected to wear Indian clothes to office and follow Indian dress codes. In 1824 to 1828, Governor General Amherst insisted that Indians take their shoes off as a sign of respect when they appeared before him. So he wanted the Indians to take off their shoes as a sign of respect before him, but this was not strictly followed. By the mid-19th century, when Lord Dalhousie was Governor General, shoe respect was made stricter, and Indians were made to take off their shoes when entering any government institution. Only those who wore Indian clothes were exempted from this rule. Many Indian government servants were increasingly uncomfortable with these rules. In 1862, there was a famous case of defiance of the shoe respect rule in a Surat courtroom. Manokji Kowasji NT. So, Manokji Kowasji NT and assessor in the Surat Fauzdari Adalat refused to take off his shoes in the court of the sessions judge. The judge insisted that he take off his shoes, as that was the Indian way of showing respect to superiors. But Manokje remained adamant. He was barred entry into the courtroom, and he sent a letter of protest to the governor of Bombay. The British insisted that since Indians took off their shoes when they entered a sacred place or home, they should do so when they entered the courtroom. In the controversy that followed, Indians urged that taking off shoes in sacred places and at home was linked to two different questions. Number one, there was the problem of dirt and filth. Shoes collected the dirt on the road. This dirt could not be allowed into places that were clean, particularly when people in Indian homes sat on the ground. Second, leather shoes and the filth that stuck under it were seen as polluting, but public buildings like the courtroom were different from home. And here is a source D. When asked to take off his shoes at the Surat Faujdari Adalat at Surat in 1862, Manokji told the judge that he was willing to take off even his turban but not his shoes. He said, "Taking off my puggree would have been a greater insult to myself than to the court, but I would have submitted to it, because there is nothing of conscience or religion involved in it. I hold no respect or disrespect, embodied or disembodied, in the shoes, but the putting on of our turban is the greatest of all respect that we pay. We do not have our puggrees on when at home, but when we go out to see respectable persons, we are bound by social etiquette to have it on, whilst we, Parsis, in our social intercourse never ever take off our shoes before any Parsi, however great." But it took many years before shoes were permitted into the courtroom. So it took a long time for shoes to be permitted into the courtroom. 5. Designing the national dress. Here's a figure. Jananada Nandini Tagore, which is on the left, with her husband Satyendranath Tagore and other family members. She is wearing a Brahmika sari with a blouse modeled on a western gown. As nationalist feelings swept across India by the late 19th century, Indians began devising cultural symbols that would express the unity of the nation. Artists looked for a national style of art. Poets wrote national songs. Then a debate began over the design of the national flag. The search for a national dress was part of this move to define the cultural identity of the nation in symbolic ways. Self-conscious experiments with dress engaged men and women of the upper classes and caste in many parts of India. The Tagore family of Bengal experimented beginning in the 1870s with designs for a national dress for both men and women in India. Rabindranath Tagore suggested that instead of combining Indian and European dress, India's national dress should combine elements of Hindu and Muslim dress. Thus, the chapkan, a long buttoned coat, was considered the most suitable dress for men. So, a chapkan, a long buttoned coat, was considered the most suitable dress for men. There were also attempts to develop a dress style that would draw on the tradition of different regions. In the late 1870s, Jananada Nandini Devi, wife of Satyendranath Tagore, the first Indian member of the ICS, returned from Bombay to Calcutta. She adopted the Parsi style of wearing the sari pinned to the left shoulder with a brooch and worn with a blouse and shoes. This was quickly adopted by Brahmo Samaji women and came to be known as the Brahmika sari. So it came to be called Brahmika sari. This style gained acceptance before long among Maharashtrians. So it gained acceptance among Maharashtrians, then Uttar Pradesh Brahmos as well as non-Brahmos. Here's a figure 16, Lady Batubai, 1890, a well-known Parsi social activist. She is wearing a silk gara embroidered with swans and peonies, a common English flower. So what is Brahmo? Those belonging to the Brahmo Samaj. However, these attempts at devising a pan-Indian style did not fully succeed. Women of Gujarat, Kodagu, Kerala and Assam continue to wear different types of sari. We have another figure 19, Maharani of Travancore, 1930. Note the western shoes and the modest long-sleeved blouse. This style had become common among the upper classes by the early 20th century. So here we have source E. Some people supported the attempt to change women's clothing, others opposed it. Any civilized nation is against the kind of clothing in use in the present time among women of our country. Indeed, it is a sign of shamelessness. Educated men have been greatly agitated about it. Almost everyone wishes for another kind of civilized clothing. There is a custom here of women wearing fine and transparent clothing which reveals the whole body. Such shameless attire in no way allows one to frequent civilized company. Such clothes can stand in the way of our moral improvement. Source F. C. Keshavan's autobiography, Jivita Shamaram. So, C. Kesavan's autobiography, Jivita Samaram, recalls his mother-in-law's first encounter with a blouse gifted by her sister-in-law in the late 19th century. It looked good, but I felt ticklish wearing it. I took it off, folded it carefully, and brimming with enthusiasm showed it to my mother. She gave me a stern look and said, "Where are you going to gallivant in this?" So she gave me a stern look and said, "Where are you going to gallivant in this? Fold it and keep it in the box." I was scared of my mother. She could kill me. At night I wore the blouse and showed it to my husband. He said it looked good. The next morning I came out wearing the blouse. I didn't notice my mother coming. Suddenly I heard her break a piece from a coconut branch. When I turned round, she was behind me, fierce and furious. She said, "Take it off. You want to walk around in skirts like Muslim women." 5.1 The Swadeshi Movement. You have read about the Swadeshi movement in Bengal in the first decade of the 20th century. If you reflect back on the movement, you will realize that it was centrally linked to the politics of clothing. What was this politics? You know that the British first came to trade in Indian textiles that were in great demand all over the world. India accounted for one-fourth of the world's manufactured goods. So India accounted for one-fourth of the world's manufactured goods in the 17th century. There were 1 million weavers in Bengal alone in the middle of the 18th century. However, the Industrial Revolution in Britain, which mechanized spinning and weaving and greatly increased the demand of raw material such as cotton and indigo, changed India's status in the world economy. Political control of India helped Britain in two ways. The first one is that Indian peasants could be forced to grow crops such as indigo, and cheap British manufacture easily replace coarser Indian one. Okay. So political control of India helped the British in two ways. The first one is that Indian peasants could be forced to grow crops such as indigo, and the second one is that cheap British manufacture easily replaced coarser Indian ones. Large numbers of Indian weavers and spinners were left without work, and important textile weaving centers such as Murshidabad, Machilipatnam, and Surat declined as demand fell. Yet, by the middle of the 20th century, large numbers of people began boycotting British or mill made clothes and adopting khadi, even though it was coarser, more expensive, and difficult to obtain. How did this change come about? In 1905, Lord Curzon decided to partition Bengal to control the growing opposition to British rule. The Swadeshi movement developed in reaction to this measure. People were urged to boycott British goods of all kinds and start their own industries for the manufacture of goods such as matchboxes and cigarettes. Mass protest followed, with people vowing to cleanse themselves of colonial rule. The use of khadi was made a patriotic duty. Women were urged to throw away their silks and glass bangles and wear simple shell bangles. Rough homespun was glorified in songs and poems to popularize it. The change of dress appealed largely to the upper caste and classes rather than to those who had to make do with less and could not afford the new products. After 15 years, many among the upper classes also returned to wearing European dress. Though many people rallied to the cause of nationalism at this time. Though many people rallied to the cause of nationalism at this time, it was almost impossible to compete with cheap British goods that had flooded the market. Despite its limitations, the experiment with Swadeshi gave Mahatma Gandhi important ideas about using cloth as a symbolic weapon against British rule. Figure 20. The familiar image of Mahatma Gandhi, bare chested and at his spinning wheel. Mahatma Gandhi's experiments with clothing. The most familiar image of Mahatma Gandhi is of him seated, bare chested, and in a short dhoti at the spinning wheel. He made spinning on the charkha and the daily use of khadi or coarse cloth made from homespun yarn very powerful symbols. These were not only symbols of self-reliance but also of resistance to the use of British mill-made cloth. So these were not only symbols of self-reliance but also of resistance to the use of British mill-made clothes. Mahatma Gandhi's experiments with clothes sum up the changing attitude to dress in the Indian subcontinent. As a boy from a Gujarati Banya family, so he was from a Gujarati Banya family. He usually wore a shirt and a dhoti or pajama and sometimes a coat. When he went to London to study law as a boy of 19 in 1888, he cut off the tuft on his head. So he cut off the tuft on his head and dressed in a western suit so that he would not be laughed at. On his return, he continued to wear western suits, topped with a turban. As a lawyer in Johannesburg, South Africa in the 1890s, he still wore western clothes. So we have some images of Mahatma Gandhi. Figure 21, Mahatma Gandhi in his earliest known picture, aged 7. Figure 22, Mahatma Gandhi at age 14 with a friend. Then Figure 23, Mahatma Gandhi seated from right, London, 1890, at the age of 21, not the typical Western three-piece suit. Figure 24, in Johannesburg in 1900, still in Western dress, including tie. Figure 25, in 1913 in South Africa, dressed for Satyagraha. So he changed his dress. Soon he decided that dressing unsuitably was a more powerful political statement. In Durban in 1813, Gandhi first appeared in a lungi. So he first appeared in a lungi and kurta in 1913 in Durban, with his head shaved as a sign of mourning to protest against the shooting of Indian coal miners. So in Durban in 1913, Gandhi first appeared in a lungi and kurta with his head shaved as a sign of mourning to protest against the shooting of Indian coal miners. On his return to India in 1915, he decided to dress like a Kathiawadi peasant. So he decided to dress like a Kathiawadi peasant. Only in 1921 did he adopt the short dhoti, the form of dress he wore until his death. On 22nd September 1921, a year after launching the non-cooperation movement, which sought Swaraj in 1 year, he announced, So he announced I propose to discard at least up to 31st of October my topi and vest, and to content myself with a loincloth and a chadar whenever necessary for protection of my body. I adopt the change because I have always hesitated to advise anything I may not be prepared to follow. So here is a figure. Figure 26. Mahatma Gandhi with Kasturba shortly after his return from South Africa. Dressed simply, he later confessed to feeling awkward amongst the westernized Bombay elite. He said that he was more at home among the laborers in South Africa. At this time he did not want to use this dress all his life and only wanted to experiment for a month or two. But soon he saw this as his duty to the poor and he never wore any other dress. He consciously rejected the well-known clothes of the Indian ascetic and adopted the dress of the poorest Indian. So he consciously rejected the well-known clothes of the Indian ascetic and adopted the dress of the poorest Indian. Khadi, white and coarse, was to him a sign of purity, of simplicity and of poverty. So khadi, white and coarse, was to him a sign of purity, of simplicity, and of poverty. Wearing it became also a symbol of nationalism, a rejection of Western mill-made clothes. He wore the short dhoti without a shirt when he went to England for the Round Table Conference in 1931. He refused to compromise and wore it even before King George V at Buckingham Palace. When he was asked by journalists whether he was wearing enough clothes to go before the king, he joked that the king had enough on for both of us. 5.3. Not all could wear khadi. Mahatma Gandhi's dream was to clothe the whole nation in khadi. He felt khadi would be a means of erasing difference between religions, classes, etc. But was it easy for others to follow in his footsteps? Was such a unity possible? Not many could take to the single peasant loincloth as he had. So not many could take to the single peasant loincloth as he had, nor did all want to. Here are some examples of other responses to Mahatma Gandhi's call. Nationalists such as Motilal Nehru, a successful barrister from Allahabad, gave up his expensive Western style suits and adopted the Indian dhoti and kurta, but these were not made of coarse cloth. Those who had been deprived by caste norms for centuries were attracted to Western dress styles. Therefore, unlike Mahatma Gandhi, other nationalists such as Baba Sahib Ambedkar never gave up the Western style suit. Many Dalits began in the early 1910s to wear three-piece suits and shoes and socks on all public occasions as a political statement of self-respect. A woman who wrote to Mahatma Gandhi from Maharashtra in 1928 said, A year ago, I heard you speaking on the extreme necessity of every one of us wearing khadi and thereupon decided to adopt it. But we are poor people. My husband says khadi is costly. Belonging as I do to Maharashtra, I wear a sari 9 yards long, and the elders will not hear of a reduction to 6 yards. Other women like Sarojini Naidu and Kamala Nehru wore colored saris with designs instead of coarse white homespun. Conclusion. Changes in styles of clothing are thus linked up with shifts in cultural taste and notions of beauty, with changes within the economy and society, and with issues of social and political conflict. So, when we see clothing styles alter, we need to ask, why do these changes take place? What do they tell us about society and its history? What can they tell us about changes in taste and technologies, markets and industries? Box 4. The Gandhi Cape. Some time after his return to India from South Africa in 1915, Mahatma Gandhi transformed the Kashmiri cape that he sometimes used into a cheap white cotton khadi cape. For 2 years from 1919 he himself wore the cape and then gave it up, but by this time it had become part of the nationalist uniform and even a symbol of defiance. For example, the Gwalior state tried to prohibit its use in 1921 during the non-cooperation movement. During the Khilafat movement, the cape was worn by large numbers of Hindus and Muslims. A group of Santals who attacked the police in 1922 in Bengal, demanding the release of Santhal prisoners, believed that the Gandhi cape would protect them from bullets. 3 of them died as a result. Large numbers of nationalists defiantly wore the Gandhi cape and were even beaten or arrested for doing so. With the rise of the Khilafat movement in the post-First World War years, the face, desolate Turkish cape, became a sign of anti-colonialism in India. So it became a face, this cape, which is called as face, became a sign of anti-colonialism in India. Though many Hindus, as in Hyderabad for instance, also wore the face, it soon became identified solely with Muslims. Figure 27. 1915 Mahatma Gandhi with a turban. Figure 28. 1915 in an embroidered Kashmiri cape. Figure 29. 1920 wearing the Gandhi cape. Figure 30. 1921 after shaving his head. Figure 31 on his visit to Europe in 1931. By now his clothes had become a powerful political statement against Western cultural domination. So that's all guys. See you in my next video. Bye.